So now we're on Daf Lamed Vav Amid Beis, and we're trying to understand what Rabbi Elazar derived from the extra pasuk Mikol ha'ochel asher ye'ochel. And apparently the Gemara is going to establish that's a mute. Lav l'me'ute chivas kodesh. It means it comes to exclude chivas kodesh. That chivas kodesh, since it doesn't come in contact, it hadn't come in contact with any liquids. It's not mukshal l'kabel tuma, and it's not upgraded to an equal status of that of kodesh. And again, I don't know if this is significant, but it's almost as if, according to Rabbi Elazar, it says ki'itein mayim twice to tell you and emphasize it's got to be mayim, even though kodshim doesn't require machshir, and the Gemara is going to derive that from psukim. But nevertheless, we're talking now about chivas kodesh, and chivas kodesh requires a liquid to be machshir, and the Gemara says lo. The Gemara says that Rabbi Elazar has no leg to stand on. He has no proof from the text of the Torah. And why is that? Because the Torah is teaching you something about the machshirim. And what is it teaching you about a machshirim? That chad betumas sheretz and chad betumas mes. There are two categories of Tuma, which Gemara now is going to compare and contrast. And you have to know the law that Tuma is only applicable with a machshir, if there was one of the machshir, the seven mashkim. And now I need to learn that halacha both in terms of a Tuma that's as powerful as sheretz and a Tuma as powerful as contact with the corpse. Diashmin and Tumas Mes Hasam Hu Boy Hechsha Mishum Delo Metami Kadosha Aval Sheretz and Metami Kadosha Emeloli Boy Hechsher. Right, with regard to Tumas Mes, you have to have a Kizais Min Mes in order to generate Tuma. With regard to Sheretz, even if it's as small as a lentil, which is called Kadasha, that's enough to be Metame and to pass on the Tuma. So Sheretz is more Chomer than Tumas Mes in terms of the shear. And therefore, I would think, I would think that because of the super duper chumrah and the stringency of Tumah, of Kabbalah's Tumah with regard to a sheretz, that sheretz is Tameh Bekadasha, I would think, therefore, drop the condition of a machshir. V'yashmin in sheretz, I would say, no, fakir, that Tumas Mes is more chomer, more strict than Tumas sheretz. Why? Because Tumas sheretz is Yol Metame Tumas Shiva. Right, you're only tamei until you get tefillah and harif shemesh, but mes mitami tuva shiva. You have 7 days of tumah. You see, the Torah is much more stringent with regard to tumas mes than it is with regard to tumas sheretz. Is therefore, I might think lowly boy hechshin. I don't need a machshir. The Torah says that to come in contact with a mes is so contaminable. Is so. What's the word? Is so metame, contaminable? Is there such a word? Anyway, that therefore it's metame even without mashk. Masiv Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Yosef is again going to attack Rabbi Elazar, which is a little bit strange because the Gemara already rejected Rabbi Elazar's proof. Okay, but apparently, even though the Gemara rejected it, Rabbi Elazar didn't reject it. So we have Rabbi Yosef standing up to the plate, and he's going to reject it. And the Mishnah testifies that Rabbi Shimon Omer Huchsharu Beshchita Huchsharu, meaning that you don't need any of the Zayin Mashkim with regard to the meat that was slaughtered, because the Shechita itself being so powerful that it's matir Ever ben Achai and allows you to consume this meat, that itself is enough to be machshiv the meat through the shechita and give it the status of Kabbalah's Tuva, it's susceptible to Kabbalah's Tuva even without a machshir. That means that now we're going to classify the vegetable or whatever it was that received, I'm sorry, let's talk about the meat. The meat that was shechted, we're going to upgrade it to a full status of tumah. And why is that? Because Rebbe holds that the shechita itself generates the hechsher. You don't need any of the zayin mashkim. And now the status of the basar after shechita is that of a rishon and a sheni, which means that it could pass on tumah to a shlishi and a revi. Amai, I don't get it. This doesn't make sense according to Rabbi Loza. After all, Rabbi Loza had a principle that in order for an ochel to pass on tumah, to be capable of passing on tumah, it has to have one of the 7 mashkim, and here you don't have one of the 7 mashkim. Now, for some reason, the Gemara thinks that this logic is doraisa, probably because Rabbi Loza derived it from an extra pasuk. Amalei Abaye, so the Rabbanon stepped in here, and they made it kehechsher mayim midrabanan. We consider it as if there was water on the meat. The meat therefore became muchshar lekabel tuma, and therefore, and although at a deraisa level there was no water there, and therefore how could this meat pass on tumah, gaining a status as a rishon hasheni and now being mitami shlisha revi? That's only midrabanan. So that although Rabbi Lazar, and that's what Abai is saying, Rabbi Lazar is dealing with doraisas, however, Abai is telling us no, that we're not dealing with doraisas here. We're dealing with the rabbanans. There's no water here. So there's no hechshel kabel tumah. Omer Rabbi Seira Toshma, another objection against Rabbi Loza. I'm being to feel bad about Rabbi Loza. Anyway, Toshma. Okay, now what's the subject of this brisa? When they crush the grapes to get the juices out of the grapes, which is called the gat, gimel tuf. And what happens when they harvest the grapes, which is called bitsira, and then it goes into baskets, which are placed in the gat for pressing, to exude, to remove, to extract the grape juice. But now, as they are picking the grapes and putting it into baskets, then already some grapes are sitting on top of other grapes. And therefore, there's juice that's running down the grapes. And the question is whether that now the grapes are mukshal lekabel tumah. Beit Shammai omer huksha, Hillel omer lo huksha. Hillel Shammai. Okay, so at the end of the day, Hillel accepted Shammai, and they consider it mukshal lekabel tumah. Okay, so what's the kasha now? Amai, now the Gemara says kasha. Halav ochel haba b'mayim hu. What happens? These baskets apparently have holes in them, so the little small amount of grape juice that comes down in the baskets will go le'ibud, meaning they're completely lost. Therefore, that liquid could not be machshel kabel tum, because you have to want the liquids. Here you don't want the liquids. It's going to just go through the baskets and get lost. So the Gemara says that this is a contradiction to Rabbi Loza, because Rabbi Loza says that there's no tum unless it's baba mayim. Amalei Abai says, Asom kehechsher mayim mirabbanan. Why? The Rabbanan were afraid that if we allow you, in the case of the baskets, to consider the grapes as tar, then you might go mistakenly make a jump, a leap of faith, and extend that halacha even if the grapes were put not in baskets, but rather in containers. What are they called? These lock and locks. You remember the lock and locks? I wish I had that patent. We use it all the time, lock and lock. So if you put the grapes in a lock and lock, then as opposed to baskets, the drops of juice that flow from the grapes will be collected in the lock and lock. And therefore he wants it. And if he wants it, then it's a bona fide machshir. It's a liquid of mashke that's machshir l'kabel tumah. So Shammai introduced the gzera, even though in the case of the basket, the drops are going through the holes down to home, to the end of the earth. But nevertheless, we don't want you to mistake it with a case where you have it in a lock. Rav Yosef turns to Abai and he says, Amina lecha na hukshra b'shchita v'at amret li ason kehechsher mayim. I don't get it. Rav Yosef says to Abaye, you made this big deal about aso kehechsher mayim. That the Rabbanan made it such that the meat after shechita is as if it came in contact with a liquid, meaning with dam, even though we're holding now like Reb Shimon that dam shechita is no machshir. The Amar Loch Rabbi Zera, the Amrit Le Asau Kehechsher Mayim. Amar Loch Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera said that it's as if the Rabbanan upgraded to the status as if there was already juice. You know, the juice of the grapes were actually in a container and they were being held. So it's like Mayim. Is Reb Shimon ben Lakish, why not go consistently and apply the same logic, same definition to Reish Lakish and say Aso kehechsher Mayim? Meaning, why was Reish Lakish vacillating back and forth if we have this principle of Ason, we're going to make it kehechsher Mayim? Just 1 second. Right. So you remember in Reish Lakish, a lump in the mincha that had no contact with the shemen, and Reish Lakish vacillated back and forth. Do we apply chivas hakodesh and upgrade it to the status of kodesh? And therefore, despite the fact, after the sheretz fell on the lump, there's no liquid there, it's considered as if it's right. Ason kamisha huchshar b'mayim. So why is Reish Lakish vacillating about this? Amalei, Abai response of Yosef, Otu Reish Lakish litlos kami boile, ki kami boile lisrov. In other words, Rav Shimon ben Lakish would certainly accept the fact that you can't eat this food. The flour of the mincha was definitely contaminated, and it's a mincha tmeh. Why? Because the Rabbanan made it as if it had mayim. And that's a result of chibas kodesh. But Reish Lakish is still vacillating because do we burn it? Are we giving it a full-fledged status of tumah? But here it has to be doraisa. That's why I told you, Rabosai, that this sugya, as we'll soon see, seems to be assuming, working with the premise that chibas kodesh is doraisa, michlal, the chibas kodesh doraisa, minola. So if Rav Shimon ben Lakish is asking whether you burn that lump of flour that's dry, it didn't have any contact with shemen, then he must be dealing with Tumah Doraisa. So it means that we have to upgrade Chibas Kodesh to the status of Doraisa. Is that Minolan? Where do we know this from? The meat that touches anything that's tameh shall not be eaten. That means that basar kochim becomes tameh, and therefore you're not allowed to eat it. How did it become tameh? Let's go through some of the possibilities. Hi, basar this kasha b'mai. If you're going to tell me lema this kasha b'dam v'ha'omar Reb Chia bar Abba Reb Yochanan minayin l'dam kochim she'eno machshir. That dam kochim is not a machshir because it doesn't fit into the description of the machshir, namely. Lo sochlet al aretz nishchad b'mayim dam nishka k'mayim machshir, but she'eno nishchad k'mayim eno machshir. Right, the dam of kochim is collected in a mizrach and then you throw it on the mizbeach. So therefore, it's not similar to mayim, and therefore it doesn't have the status of a machshir. Ella, the only way you could possibly understand this is by saying this kasher b'mashke base mitvachaya. That's not going to do us any good either, right? There was a base mitvachaya in the base hamikdash, and that's where they butchered the animals for purposes of nituach, and they used water to clear off all the blood and so forth and so on. And now you're telling me that maybe, the susceptibility, got that word straight, of meat is based on the fact that it got washed with water in the Beis HaMitbachayim where they washed the kachim. Rabbi Yossi mashki Beis Mitbachaya lo dayan she'ein dachan that etar ela she'ein machshirin. So in other words, we can't say that the water that comes to the Beis Mitbachayim is going to be machshir the shlomim to kabel tum. The chiyutim, and now you're going to possibly offer the possibility of tigma adam. Maybe you're going to say that which we saw in Rabbi Yossi is referring to the dam that came out of the Beis Mitbachayim, not the mayim, but the dam. For mashki ka'omar, Rabbi Yossi uses a plural form mashki, so he must be talking about two liquids. He's referring to both dam and mayim. So it's clear that the mayim, which is used in the Beis Mitbachayim to wash off the meat of shlamim, that cannot be the medium through which the meat becomes susceptible to tumah. And therefore, if it's two liquids, it includes not just mayim, but also dam. So now, if we excluded all the other possibilities of justifying why the meat is susceptible to tumah, then we have to introduce chibas kodesh. Why is it susceptible to tumah? It can't be because of the dam, because dam kodesh me'enu machshir. It can't be because of mashki beis mitbachaya, because mashki beis mitbachaya ain't machshirin, and it can't be because of dam, because the brisa seems to indicate that dam is not a machshir. Elalav this kasha b'chidus hakodesh. It means that b'chibas hakodesh we upgrade the status of the meat to kodzim, and therefore it's susceptible even without machshirim, and that's a dorais halacha. How are we doing on the clock? Oh, we have another 5 minutes. Let's see what we can accomplish here. So again, bottom line, we have to remember as we go forward that mashke, that chibas hakodesh will be upgraded da'oraisa to the status of Kodesh, and therefore it's mukshal lekabel tuma even without any contact with liquids. Frek the Gemara v'dilma Rabbi Yehuda Shmuel. Maybe when the Torah tells us that the meat is susceptible to tuma even without liquids, that's kigon shoiselo para shel zivchei shlomim ve'vira benachal. All right, so now we have a para of shlomim, and he's on the way to take this para of shlomim to the Beis Hamikdash, and he walks the cow through a river. Now, when he shechts this carbon shlomim, the liquid is still upon the para, on the cow. Right? What liquid are we talking about? We're talking about the water from the river, from the nachal. So that memela, when it's still on the meat, so the meat is moist due to the water that came from the nachal, and therefore it's mukshal lekabel tuma. If that's the case, then it has nothing to do with chibas hakodesh. So again, just to reiterate what we said, the first part of the pasuk was superfluous. We weren't able to successfully derive any proof from the first part of the pasuk. That's what the Gemara is going to say now. Ela miseifa vehabasar. Why did the Torah add the word vehabasar, which is superfluous? Lerabos eitzim ulevona. Don't eat eitzim v'levona. Give it a break. Who eats eitzim v'levona? Eitzim v'levona b'rei achila ninu? Elachidas hakodesh machsharta lehu umashvile ochel hachinami chibas kodesh machsharte, and it makes it into an ochel. So we say that it's mekabel tuma, even though it's not an ochel. How could it be mekabel tuma? And the answer is chibas hakodesh. So chibas hakodesh substitutes for the need for an ochel. And the Kabbalah's Tumah completely circumvents the need for an ochel. Now we go back to the case, by analogy, of Chibas HaKodesh. And we say the Chibas HaKodesh here, in this particular context, there was no connection or no contact, I should say, with any of the mashkim, and yet it's mukshal lekabel tuma. So just like chibas kodesh is machshir, something that's not an ochel in the case of eitzim u'levona, and it's mekabel tuma, even though it's not an ochel, so too chibas hakodesh, in a case where there's no mashkim and no machshirim that came in contact with this chibas hakodesh, nevertheless, it's susceptible to tuma, and it generates tuma, and that's a doraisa halach. Let's just see. I think we have one more minute to try to get to the mission. Okay, so now let's just summarize. According to Reish Lakish, we finally found in the Sefer a source for this chibas hakodesh that it becomes mukshal kabel tuma, even as we said, if it's not an ochel and eitzim levona, and even if there's no liquid in the case of Reish Lakish, is my. Mi mahayni chibas kodesh psula de gufe, aval binyone bei rishon usheni lo, odimol lo shna teku. So we know that chibas hakodesh is doraisa, and therefore the chibas hakodesh itself, like the meat of kodshin, even without dam to be machshir, will be makabel tuma. But we don't know whether that tuma is a full-fledged tuma like tuma de gufe, and it has a rishon and a sheni, and therefore it can pass on and infect with tuma a shlishi and a ravi, and the Gemara ends with teku, an unanswered question. And that leads us to the Mishnah here on the top of the Lamed Zayin, because we finished Lamed Vav, and the Mirza Hashem will do Lamed Zayin tomorrow.